Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Dmitri Alperovitch. He's a national security expert who founded one of the largest cybersecurity companies, CrowdStrike. His new best-selling book, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century, boldly stated that the world is fully in the midst of Cold War II, and Taiwan is a new West Berlin. He argues that if undeterred, China will invade Taiwan and trigger a devastating war between nuclear powers. Dmitri is on the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Advisory Council and previously served as a special advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense. Welcome, Dmitri.
Thanks for having me.
What motivated you to write this book? In particular, can you share what you've learned from your experience working in cybersecurity?
Well, I spent my career in cybersecurity and the last decade or so really being on the cutting edge of confronting Chinese intrusions and intrusions from out of the nation states, from Russia, from Iran and North Korea, into American networks, into Western companies' networks all over the world, and getting increasingly concerned that the Chinese in particular have been waging economic warfare against our country, against our allies across the world in order to promote their own economic interests, steal our intellectual property, steal our trade secrets, and provide it to the benefit of...
When you mention Chinese, and this is like a state-sponsored more than just the commercial, right?
Right. This is all state-sponsored. It is their MSS, Ministry of State Security, their primary intelligence agency. This is the PLA, their military that have been orchestrating these sorts of intrusions, and again, providing it to their commercial sector, to the state-owned enterprises to enable them to compete. But what motivated me to write the book was actually the invasion of Ukraine. I was one of the first geopolitical analysts back in 2021, about 3 months before the start of the conflict, to have predicted that Putin would invade that country before the end of the winter. And the reasons that I believe drove him to invade Ukraine I see playing out in the same fashion in the Taiwan Strait, and I believe are driving Xi Jinping to want to invade Taiwan. And of course, the invasion of Taiwan would be even much more devastating than the conflict in Ukraine for the world, for the American interests in particular. And I believe, unlike with Ukraine, we still have time to deter this invasion. It's not predetermined, and we have to do a lot more, as well as the Taiwanese do, to make sure that he never attempts this.
Well, so, I mean, there are always people who sort of put, Ukraine and Taiwan in sort of the same basket. From what you're saying, you also feel like there are some lessons we can learn from the Ukraine-Russia scenario. So tell us what it is that makes you think that because of, what happened on the other side of Europe, is actually resembles what may happen in the other side of the Pacific.
Well, first of all, you have these two personalities, Putin and Xi, that I think are very similar in nature. Obviously, they call each other good friends, and I think they think very similarly as well. They're both in their 70s, which is important as well, because they're looking potentially at the twilight of their years in power, potentially their lifespan, and they want to go down into the history books as having accomplished great things from their point of view. So from Putin's perspective, he has a distorted view of history where he believes that Ukraine is not a nation, that it's always belonged to the Russian Empire, and this is about restoring the natural order of things, where at a minimum, Ukraine would be in Russia's sphere of influence, if not fully controlled by Russia. Xi Jinping has the same distorted view of history about Taiwan, as I write in the book. Taiwan never actually fully belonged to China, yet Xi Jinping and the rest of the CCP are convinced that Taiwan belongs to China, and that the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, as he calls it, depends on unification with Taiwan. There's also an element of ego with those two men. Not only do they think that this is important to accomplish for their own countries, but they want to be the ones to do it. They want to take credit for it. Putin feels that he is the new Peter the Great that expanded the reach and power of the Russian Empire. Xi Jinping wants to go down into the pantheon of Chinese history as someone who's greater than Mao, that accomplished something that Mao could never do, which is, of course, take Taiwan. And then both countries, Ukraine and Taiwan, both nations, really are very similar in the sense that they have really important strategic geographic importance to both Russia, respectively, and China. In the case of Russia, Ukraine has always been viewed as this buffer state, really important land that both allowed Russia time to mobilize when they had been invaded in the past by European countries, whether it's Hitler in World War II or Napoleon in the 1800s or Teutonic Knights. There have been numerous invasions of Russia, of course, from Europe, and many of them have traversed Ukraine before they would be able to get to Moscow, and that gave them time to mobilize and respond to the threat. And then also from an offensive perspective, in order to project power into Europe and invade European countries, Ukraine, of course, is essential stopping ground on the way into Europe for Russia. Taiwan is very similar in the sense that Taiwan, I believe, is the cork that keeps China contained and bottled up within the first island chain. So if you're China, you're looking out at the world and you think that you're going to be the next global power, the next superpower, as they think is their rightful place in the world to be, because, of course, for much of human history, they were the world's greatest, most powerful country, and it was only since the advent of the Industrial Revolution that changed, first with Europeans and then America taking that crown. But if you're China looking out at the world, you feel you're completely contained by American allies and American friends and American military bases, right? You have from the east, the Korean Peninsula with South Korea hosting 28,000 American troops and air bases and radar installations, to the Japanese islands, where you have the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet and U.S. Marines in Okinawa. And at the center of that first island chain, the anchor point is Taiwan, viewed as an outpost, rightly or wrongly, of U.S. power. And then closing the arc, you have the Philippines, where once again, for the first time in 30 years, the U.S. military is getting access to the Filipino military bases. So if you're China, this is not a great place to be. And taking Taiwan allows you to escape from that containment and secure your own trade routes for your imports and exports, which of course are vital to the Chinese economy, but also to project power across the Western Pacific, to push the U.S. Navy out of that region, which has been a longstanding goal for China, and to really dominate that part of the world.
Yeah, I want to dig deeper into that because some people would argue that, in the case of Ukraine, for example, the West or the U.S.-led NATO world should not have been so strong in terms of supporting Ukraine's joining the NATO, which was viewed as a provocative move that triggered Russia's invasion. Of course, that's one type of argument, and so some people are worried that all the deterrence or defense buildup around Taiwan would be viewed as a provocative move, and therefore, China will have to take the action. How do you think about that sort of argument?
Yeah, so there are two schools of thought here. One is that NATO expansionism to Ukraine provoked this war. The other view is that it had absolutely nothing to do with it. I think the real answer is somewhere in the middle. I think it's wrong to say that it had absolutely nothing to do with it, but it's also wrong to say that it was the single cause of conflict. In fact, there's never a monocausal cause to any war, because these are complex decisions that get taken. And it's absolutely the case that Putin was looking at Ukraine, not just joining NATO, but joining the broader European Union, becoming a Western democratic country.
So he does feel threatened, would you say that?
And he absolutely sees that as a threat, but he also sees it as an opportunity to change the game, to destabilize Ukraine, to bring it into his own sphere of influence. So there are both sides of the coin here, both a defensive and offensive part that goes, I believe, into his thinking and ultimately caused him to invade Ukraine. And look, if it was just NATO expansionism, then on the face of it, he should be right now invading Finland and Sweden, because they've just joined NATO, and Finland shares a huge border, of course, with Russia. So not only are we not seeing him invading Finland, but we're not even seeing him express much concern about Finland joining NATO.
He did try Georgia a couple of years ago, right?
Tried Georgia in 2008, but again, these are former Soviet Union republics that he feels belong to Russia. Right. So that part of vision of
history,
history is really, really critical. It is not just about NATO expansionism, although that absolutely, I think, is a factor. And similarly with China, I think that China's longstanding goal, of course, has been to unify with Taiwan long before Xi Jinping, long before any sort of a massive military buildup that Taiwan and our U.S. allies have been undertaking. So it's not like Xi Jinping just woke up and said, I want to do this, right?
So,
This goes back to Mao. And I do believe that if you actually restore the military balance of power that existed across the Taiwan Strait for so many decades, you actually deter the invasion because you make it virtually impossible. Because as I write in the book, Taiwan is a natural fortress. It's one of the worst places you can possibly imagine to invade. And it doesn't take a lot to actually make sure that this invasion is an impossibility.
Yeah. Well, you did specify a date that you think China will invade Taiwan, November 13, 2028. Why is that?
Well, so my book is nonfiction, but it does start with a fictional, but I think a fairly realistic scenario of how this invasion would unfold that I do set in November of 2028. To be clear, this is not a prediction that invasion would take place in 2028 or in November of 2028, or that it would take place at all, because I do think, and the reason I wrote this book is that there's still time to deter it from ever taking place. But I do think that the window for Xi Jinping potentially opens up in 2028 and could close as soon as 2032. And let me explain why. So first of all, he's not ready to invade today. This would be the most complicated military operation ever conducted in the history of mankind. And he needs enormous sea lift capacity to bring over hundreds of thousands, potentially at least 500,000, probably more troops onto the island to conquer this place of 24 million people. This is very, very tough to do. And he needs enormous sea lift capacity, amphibious assault ships, and the rest that he simply does not have today. He's building it. He's trying to get there, but he's not yet ready. By 2028, he possibly could be ready. And we know that he's given the order to the PLA to be ready by 2027. Although, as with any government agency, just because you give someone an order to be ready by a certain date doesn't actually mean they will.
Right.
But if he does get there, the other interesting thing about 2028 is that he is past sort of the distractions that he would have in 2027 in terms of trying to secure his reelection as a Chinese Communist Party leader in the fall of 2027, establishing the new team and the new.
He will be into his fourth term, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which potentially could be his last, because in 2032, at the end of that term, he'll be 79. In Chinese leadership system, they don't tend to elect their leaders into their 80s, perhaps unlike an American system. And nevertheless, you start thinking about your own mortality and the like. But in 2028, you have the world, and Taiwan and the U.S. in particular, facing a lot of distractions as well. You have the Taiwanese elections, obviously, in January of that year, and potentially inauguration of a new president. In May, you have the Olympics in Los Angeles taking place that summer, which will be very distracting for Americans. And of course, our own elections in November of that year, where whoever wins in November of this year, Biden or Trump, it's clear that neither of those men will be running in 2028. So you might actually have a lame duck presidency, and national security team leaving for the private sector. So a hollowed out national security apparatus in the United States, a new team potentially in Taiwan taking place. So it could open up that window. And again, if he wants to accomplish it on his own watch, 2032 might be sort of the deadline for him if he's not certain, for example, about getting a fifth term in 2032 as a 79-year-old. And on top of all of this, the investments that Taiwan is making right now, the US, the Japanese, and others in the region are going to shift that balance of power back into the Allies' favor vis-a-vis China. And if you wait too long into the 2030s and 2040s, I believe this becomes once again impossible.
So basically, from now on until around that time is a critical window for Taiwan as well as the U.S. and allies to be prepared to make sure that the deterrence is strong enough to prevent any attempt by China. Is that right?
That's right. I think this is the window of opportunity in the next 4 to 8 years, which the good thing is that it's at least 4 years from now, I think, which gives us time, but it's not a lot of time, and we can't waste a minute of it.
Yeah. Well, you do argue that, Ukraine and other conflicts in the world that the U.S. has tend to is a distraction, right? So ultimately, in the long run, the U.S. really needs to focus on countering China. Why are you saying that?
Well, first of all, I believe that the U.S. is unquestionably in a Cold War II with China. We can run through all the reasons why. It's actually very similar, strikingly similar, if you look at the history of the first Cold War to that conflict. And just like with the first Cold War, I believe we need to focus on the goal of winning and first and foremost, of course, deterring an invasion of Taiwan. And that needs to be the singular focus of the U.S. foreign policy. It does not mean that we should abandon Ukraine, that we should abandon Israel, that we should not do anything across the world and completely withdraw and focus only exclusively on Asia. Of course, we didn't do that during the first Cold War either, but that this needs to be the top priority, and that we should be looking at every conflict, every entanglement we have in the world through that lens of the Cold War and asking the question, does this significantly distract us from being able to deter China and contain China in the Western Pacific, or does it enhance it, or does it not have any effect whatsoever? So I do not believe that we should withdraw support for Ukraine, for example. I think we should continue to provide them with weapon systems, particularly land-based systems that are necessary for them to defend against Russian aggression and that do not have a significant role in a conflict in Asia, which will be mostly maritime and air conflict. But I do think that we need to make sure that first and foremost, we're focusing on this most critical thing, which is deterring China and winning the Cold War.
Yeah, but as you know how Washington, D.C. works, it's very hard to get people concentrated if there's no emergency. And what's happening in Ukraine and Russia front, as well as the Middle East, obviously is happening right now. So it gets everyone's attention and in some way money and budget as well. So you're not the first one to say there's been a growing, I would say, a voice in Washington, D.C., arguing that really the investment needs to match the rhetoric in Washington, D.C. when it comes to deterring China. But what would be the right balance? Because you also said that you're not, advocating for withdrawing support for Ukraine, but what is the right amount of support in Ukraine, or what is the right amount of investment in order to really counter China?
Well, again, I think we need to change our perceptions. I think we need to acknowledge that we're in a Cold War with China. And once you do that, things become much more clear and prioritization becomes.
And why do you think DC, or at least this current administration, is unwilling to go there?
Well, I think they view it as provocative. I think privately, when you talk to them, they would admit that we're in a new Cold War. Publicly, they feel like this would anger China if you say so. But of course, the Chinese already assume that we're in a Cold War. You read their writings, they think that America is containing them, which we absolutely are. There's no question about this. So at the end of the day, you're not deluding them. You're only deluding the American public, and you're deluding yourself because you tie yourself in knots in these debates of, are we competing with China? Are we cooperating with them? Which one wins on any given issue? And if you're in a Cold War, if you set that frame and the goal is victory, then a lot of those debates become easier. And again, we've had distractions, some of them very unhelpful during the first Cold War. Vietnam War, of course, comes to mind. But it was all done within the framework of we're in a Cold War and making sure that those entanglements do not endanger our overall position and our strive for victory in that Cold War. So if you set that frame of mind that we're in a Cold War, again, it does not mean we withdraw from the rest of the world. We only focus on Taiwan and Asia. But you ask the questions anytime you do engagement in Ukraine, in the Middle East, or elsewhere, is this going to hurt us in our confrontation with China, or is this going to be a negligible effect or potentially even help us? And that will help you to prioritize investments and decide what makes sense and what doesn't.
And so it's interesting when you say that, and I feel like if you talk to some of the top decision makers sitting in the White House, they would definitely say China is the ultimate threat or competitor. However, they're so distracted. And do you think domestic politics plays a role, or they simply do not know how to prioritize China for lack of a strategy, or what are the reasons behind sort of not making it crystally clear that China is the U.S. next most important sort of.
Well, I think there's still active debates going on in the administration. I think the national security establishment, the Department of Defense, National Security Council are broadly on board. But there are others, particularly the Department of Treasury, that doesn't believe that believes that we need to have a better economic relationship with China, and that's the most important thing to help grow the U.S. economy. And again, if you tell them we're in a Cold War, that really frame of mind goes out the window, because you are now focusing on the most important thing. And I like to say the most important thing is to keep the main thing the main thing.
Yeah. Well, you also mentioned using that Cold War sort of framework. You also say Taiwan is the Berlin of Cold War too. And if Taiwan didn't exist as the flashpoint in the US-China relationship, the entire arc of the next decade will look different. Can you just elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So I believe that the analogy between West Berlin in particular and Taiwan is very apt. Because West Berlin was really that key flashpoint during the first Cold War that almost brought America and the Soviet Union to a hot conflict. Except for 13 days in the Cuban Missile Crisis, nothing else really came close. And in 1961, President Kennedy actually wanted to have a better relationship with the Soviet Union. When he first came into office, he wrote letters to Khrushchev asking for a summit that they ultimately had in Vienna in June of that year, saying we don't need to be adversaries, let's figure out a way to work together. And Khrushchev would have none of it. And he basically said, I need you to pull troops out of West Berlin or I'm going to invade. And President Kennedy decided that he's going to stand up for West Berlin, that he's going to fight for it, including at the risk of nuclear war. He warned the American public in the summer of that year that they need to prepare for nuclear conflict. He asked Congress to allocate money for fallout shelters, nuclear fallout shelters, in anticipation of that conflict. And then Khrushchev blinked. And in August of 1961, Kennedy is told that the East Germans were now building the wall. And he says, thank God. He celebrated that because he said, if they're building the wall, they're not invading. It's not a great solution, he said, but it's better than war. And that actually enabled the Cold War to get stabilized. It led to detente in the 1970s, arms control agreements, the pulling back from the brink of the two nations, because there's really no other place where the United States and the Soviet Union, aside from that short Cuban Missile Crisis, would go to war. And it would not go to war with each other over Vietnam or over even Korea or any other place, because West Berlin and the expansionism of the Soviet Union into Western Europe was seen as a vital threat to U.S. interests, one that we would fight for, and one that was really, really important to the Soviet Union to push their luck with. And Taiwan is that place both for the United States and for China. I've already explained why it matters to China. Similarly, it matters to the United States because not only is our credibility on the line with Taiwan, but if you allow China to dominate Taiwan, to establish naval bases on the eastern shore of Taiwan, where the waters are very deep, submarine bases, sonar installations, and the like, you basically threaten the U.S. naval presence across that whole region and allow China to dominate East Asia and establish their own security order and trade order in the most important region in the world. We have almost 50% of the world's GDP, most of the supply chains, most of the economic growth, and it endangers U.S. national security in a very direct way. Not to mention, of course, that Taiwan is a factory for the production of semiconductors and would have an incredibly destructive effects on not just the U.S., but the global economy if there's any sort of conflict with China. And if you stabilize the Taiwan Strait, if you build sort of a metaphorical wall across the Taiwan Strait, I'm not arguing for an actual wall, but if you make invasion an impossibility, you could actually stabilize the relationship with China. You could go back to the Cold War will prevail, but you could go back to a conversation about how you compete with them around the world, because there's no other place where America would actually risk a war with China and nuclear power except Taiwan. We would not fight over some rocks and artificial islands in the South China Sea or the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. There's just no prospect of that ever taking place. But Taiwan is too strategic for us. And indeed, President Biden on now 4 occasions has said that he would send American troops to fight for
Actually,
Taiwan.
5. He did that for the Time Magazine interview as well. Yeah. It
was a little bit more caveated in that interview, but he was very clear in the first 4 occasions for sure.
Yeah. Well, with all these very compelling arguments, so what should, whether it's a second Biden or a second Trump administration do?
Well, first of all, I believe there's a 3-part approach to winning this new Cold War II, as I call it, with China. It starts with deterring Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I've explained why that really matters. And you need both economic leverage as well as shifting the military balance of power that has eroded way too much in the last 2 decades to bring it back into allies' favor, into Taiwan's favor. And look, as I said, this is going to be an incredibly difficult operation if he launches it. Last week was the 80th anniversary of the invasion of Normandy, D-Day. 160,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel, of course, to invade the beaches of Normandy. But it is also the 80th anniversary of another amphibious invasion, which never took place, which was a planned Allied invasion, or mostly U.S. invasion of Formosa, as Taiwan was called at the time, which was Operation Causeway, that called for 300,000 troops to invade Taiwan and to spend 2 months fighting.
Can you say more about that? Because I don't think that's gotten enough attention.
Absolutely. So obviously in the fight with the Japanese across the Pacific, we were island hopping, and a number of people on the U.S. Joint Staff were of the belief that Taiwan was essential as a platform for having bases to bomb mainland Japan prior to invading Japan, and they had to take Formosa. And they developed a very extensive plan in the summer of 1944. It was finalized in August of 1944, just 2 months after the invasion of Normandy, to accomplish that goal. Again, the plan was much more extensive, much more riskier than the Normandy plan, called for twice the number of forces that you had in Normandy. Unlike Normandy, it did not call for invasion of the beaches, because there was an appreciation even back then that you can't really take Taiwanese beaches. They're too shallow. The waters around them are too shallow. They're too rocky. They're up against mountains. And it called for the invasion of the southern port and then fighting up north to the capital for several months, incurring huge casualties. And President Roosevelt and Douglas MacArthur and others looked at that plan and said, no, this is too hard. The casualties are unacceptable. We're going to find another way. And ultimately, of course, we invaded Okinawa on the path to Japan. So this is very difficult. It was difficult even then, much more difficult than Normandy, and deemed much riskier. This is even more difficult today because, of course, the advances in military technology have largely worked to the advantage of defense. Capabilities like anti-ship missiles, like autonomous and smart mines, like air defense systems and stingers and man pads like that, and anti-tank guided missiles like javelins, give defense an enormous advantage against an attacking force. And the challenge you have is in the last 20 years, because of U.S. distraction, because I think Taiwan took their eye off the ball and thought that as long as they had a better relationship with China, the Chinese would never think about invading, that advantage has eroded, and we need to restore it as quickly as possible. And the key to this is asymmetric defense, to prevent the Chinese from ever being able to cross the strait and to try to take the ports in Taiwan where they need to unload hundreds of thousands of troops and logistics and armored vehicles that you need to actually try to conquer this island of 24 million people. And of course, you can stop that. And particularly with enormous amounts of anti-ship missiles, mines, drones that can sink that fleet before it can get across, you make this invasion an impossibility. And we need to do that first and foremost. Secondly, we need to increase our economic leverage over China. I'm not for decoupling. Decoupling is impossible to do. The Chinese economy is simply too big. And frankly, it's counterproductive, because if you decouple, then that means you have no leverage over them, which is not what you want. But I'm for a concept I coined in the book called unidirectional entanglement, essentially creating that asymmetric dependence where China is more reliant on us and Taiwan and other allies, and we're less reliant on them. So in areas like semiconductors, we need to make sure that we don't allow the Chinese semiconductor production industry to develop, that TSMC continues to be the dominant player along with Samsung in Korea and
Right, just on that point, right? Some people would argue that actually some of the actions we're taking because of our policies actually have helped China be more alarmed and want to be independent instead of relying on the US or the West. In your view on that?
Well, I mean, we have, the Chinese have launched, had a policy of getting to independence, to reducing their dependence on the West. The Made in China 2025 policy, which they're going to meet, is all about that, of course. So it's about encouraging domestic investments, about kicking out Western competitors out of China and reducing their dependence on it. But we have enormous leverage here. In the semiconductor manufacturing space, for example, there are 3 countries that are manufacturing equipment that you need in a modern fab. They're America, Netherlands with ASML, and Japan with TEL and other firms. If those countries come together and cut off exports of the equipment to China, the Chinese fabs will cease to operate. We've cut off some of that equipment to prevent them from manufacturing the very advanced chips. I believe we need to expand that to a blanket ban, because as long as China is buying chips manufactured by TSMC, by Samsung, by Intel, and others, they're more relying on us. And of course, you can't run your economy without semiconductors. Some people call it the new oil. I believe it's more important than oil because, of course, there are alternatives to oil. There's no alternative to chips. In areas like critical minerals, we have an enormous dependency on China, whether it's rare earths or nickel or cobalt or lithium. And it's not because all the mining is in China. It's not, but they're processing so much of it. So we need to invest in our own processing and refining capacity around the world to reduce our dependency on China. So in all of these key strategic areas, we need to go technology by technology and ask ourselves, how do we increase our economic leverage over China? How do we decrease their leverage over us? And then we need to defend our innovation. We need to punish them for the massive theft of intellectual property that they've engaged in, the overcapacity that they're engaging in. So across the board, whether it's batteries, EVs, wind, solar, rare earth processing, we need to punish them.
That sounds really tough to do everything.
Well, you have to do it. And you know, we did it once in the Cold War. And look, I believe that winning Cold War II with China is a lot easier than winning the Cold War I against the Soviet Union, because China is actually much weaker. It is geographically contained. It has no alliances. You know, maybe its best ally
is Russia. It sounds like it's
not an ally. It's not an ally. China itself is barely lifting a finger to help Russia. It's not supplying military capabilities to Russia. You know, Putin just came over to Beijing, of course, with his entire cabinet and all of his oligarchs. And the readout from the meeting is that first they're going to focus on the friendship between the Chinese and Russian people. Fine. The second item on the agenda is they're going to establish a zone for the protections of tigers and leopards. Now, I believe that's really important to protect tigers and leopards, but I hardly think that it's the most important issue in the relationship between China and Russia. And of course, the Chinese did not allow the Russians to build the second pipeline, Power of Siberia 2, that the Russians desperately want to supply gas to China. They're striking a really hard bargain. It's a very transactional relationship. China has no friends. It only has its own interests and self-interests. And that's, of course, was not the case with the Soviet Union, which had an incredible alliance network, the Warsaw Pact, but also all these sympathetic regimes around the world. There were communist regimes in nature.
That's interesting. Do you have the third point about what we should do?
Well, the third point is really that defend innovation. It is punishing China for its theft of intellectual property, for its overcapacity, using tariffs, using sanctions and other measures. And it's also reforming our defense industrial base, because I think we have gotten too enamored in the United States with the highly exquisite, highly capable, but also too expensive to manufacture weapon systems, like the Ford aircraft carrier that costs $14 billion that we simply can't afford to buy in huge numbers, given the $35 trillion debt that we have. We need to get back to the basics. Quantity matters more than quality. And we need to manufacture lots and lots of munitions, particularly anti-ship missiles, particularly intermediate range ballistic missiles, mines, drones, because that's what ultimately is going to give us that advantage over China, to prevent them from carrying hundreds of thousands of forces across the Taiwan Strait, which is not easy to do and can be next to impossible in the face of a determined defense.
Well, I have to say, I have goosebumps from our conversation and from reading your book. But thank you for, I would say, sounding alarm to a certain extent to make sure that, you know, the attention and the resources and the focus is in the right place. Thank you for joining us today, Dmitri. I think we all need to be prepared for the worst scenario, and deterrence seems to be the best strategy. Thank you for joining us. Take care. Good. Well, thank you so much.
This was great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no. I will share with you those.